Have you ever seen a woman ruin her entire reputation in 10 seconds? My mother did. April 12th, 2025. The Langford Grand Hotel. Chicago's legal elite in attendance. My brother Ethan's wedding. My name is Claire Whitmore, and at 9:17 p.m., my mother tried to force me, publicly, to sign over my $3.4 million Lakeshore Drive penthouse as a wedding gift. She already had the documents printed. Already had the applause cued. All I had to do was smile and sign. Instead, I said no. And she slapped me. The sound echoed under the chandeliers. Gasps. Forks frozen midair. 200 witnesses. I bent down, picked up my earring, and made one phone call. 47 minutes later, the man she told everyone was mentally declining walked into the ballroom with a lawyer and a forensic report. "My name is Theodore Whitmore," my grandfather said calmly into the microphone. "And I have not lost my mind." And that's when my mother realized the Arizona property wasn't buried. The room shifted, because this wasn't about my penthouse anymore. It was about fraud, and possibly prison. As security escorted guests out, my brother grabbed my arm and whispered, "You don't know everything, Claire. You really don't." 3 days after the wedding, I learned something worse than the slap. The Arizona house wasn't the only forged sale. There were two. The second one, signed by Ethan, my brother, the golden child. According to the paperwork, he'd served as authorized witness on a transaction that transferred a Scottsdale property for $1.2 million. The date? The same week my grandfather was hospitalized. I drove straight to Ethan's condo. He didn't deny it. "I signed what Mom told me to sign," he said. "You're a corporate attorney," I snapped. "You knew better." His silence told me everything. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You think she did this alone?" He handed me a bank statement. Funds from the Arizona sale had moved through 3 accounts. One of them wasn't my mother's. It belonged to a private investment group, one that had recently backed Ethan's startup. Suddenly, this wasn't about greed. It was about leverage. That night, I received a message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or the penthouse won't be your biggest loss." My grandfather asked me to come over Sunday morning. No chess, no coffee, just documents. "There's something you don't know," he said. He slid over a sealed envelope labeled Codicil, Confidential Addendum. Apparently, when he updated his will in 2022, he included a clause no one knew about. If any heir attempted to coerce, manipulate, or fraudulently redirect estate assets, they would be automatically disinherited. Completely. Not reduced. Not penalized. Removed. My mother didn't know that clause existed. But if prosecutors proved fraud, she wouldn't just lose social standing. She'd lose everything, including the Beacon Hill brownstone, including her trust distributions, including access to the foundation. And if Ethan was legally complicit, he'd be cut out too. I stared at my grandfather. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because," he said quietly, "I needed to know who you all were when you thought no one was watching." Later that evening, my penthouse doorbell rang. When I opened it, Lila, Ethan's new wife, was standing there. And she said, "I didn't marry him for love." Lila stepped inside without waiting to be invited. "She's been moving money for years," she said. "Who?" "Your mother." Apparently, Margaret Whitmore had been quietly covering massive private losses from a failed investment partnership. The Arizona sale wasn't greed. It was damage control. And Ethan? He wasn't benefiting. He was drowning. My brother's startup wasn't thriving. It was leveraged. And my mother had used estate assets to keep him afloat. Illegally. "She thinks she's protecting him," Lila whispered. "But when this goes public, he'll be ruined." I felt something twist in my chest. Anger. But also something worse. Understanding. The next morning, the state's attorney's office called. They weren't asking about my mother. They wanted to speak to me. As a potential witness. 2 months later. Probate court. No chandeliers this time. No champagne. Just fluorescent lights and transcripts. My mother looked different. Smaller. Tired. But when our eyes met, there was still fire. I testified calmly. Factually. No emotion. The forensic analyst testified next. Then the hospital records. Then the bank transfers. When it was over, the judge didn't announce sentencing. That would come later. But he did say this. Evidence suggests intentional deception. And then something unexpected happened. My mother stood and asked to speak. She didn't apologize. She didn't deny it. She looked at Ethan and said, "I did it for you." The courtroom went silent. Ethan didn't look grateful. He looked devastated. That night, Ethan called me and said, "If I testify fully, she goes to prison." Then he asked, "What would you do?" December 2025. Cook County Courthouse. My mother, Margaret Whitmore, stood in a navy suit she'd worn to fundraisers for years. She didn't look like a criminal. She looked like a woman inconvenienced. The judge was clinical. 2 counts of felony fraud. 1 count of forged documentation. Financial restitution pending. 18 months. State Correctional Facility. Gasps filled the courtroom. Ethan's hand tightened around the bench. My grandfather, Theodore Whitmore, didn't react at all. When the gavel struck, something irreversible happened. Not justice. Severance. Outside, reporters shouted questions. "Ms. Whitmore, do you regret your actions?" She paused before entering the transport vehicle and said, "I protected my son." Then she looked directly at me. "And I would do it again." That night, I received a sealed envelope delivered by courier. Inside was a single document. Notice of civil claim. Whitmore Family Trust versus Claire Whitmore. Filed by my mother. From prison. The claim was strategic. Not emotional. Margaret wasn't contesting criminal charges. She was challenging the codicil clause in my grandfather's will. The one that disinherited any heir involved in fraud. Her argument? That the clause was added under undue influence. By me. If successful, the estate would freeze. The penthouse. The trust distributions. Even grandfather's foundation voting rights. I hired Adrian Vale, a trust litigation specialist who charged more per hour than I once made in a week. He read the filing once, then leaned back in his chair. "She's not trying to win," he said. "She's trying to exhaust you." Meanwhile, Ethan hadn't testified fully. He'd cooperated just enough to reduce his exposure, but not enough to bury her. When I visited her, against my better judgment, she sat behind the glass in prison gray. Calm. Composed. "You think this ends with sentencing?" she asked. "You don't understand leverage, Claire." Then she smiled. "You don't even know where all the money went." 3 days later, federal agents visited my grandfather's office. This was no longer just state fraud. It was federal. The Arizona sales were only the visible layer. Funds had moved offshore. Cayman accounts. A Luxembourg holding entity. And 1 U.S. political donation routed through a shell corporation. My grandfather was livid. "Margaret wasn't that sophisticated," he muttered. Which meant one thing. She had help. Ethan swore he didn't know about offshore transfers. But when I pressed him, something slipped. "There were advisors," he admitted. "What advisors?" "Private ones." Names followed. One of them froze me. Victor Harlan. A restructuring consultant with a reputation for operating in legal gray zones. He'd once advised my grandfather. Years ago. Adrian called me at 11:42 p.m. "We have a problem," he said. "Victor Harlan just bought a unit in your building." I met Victor Harlan in the elevator. He smiled like he already owned the room. "Claire," he said smoothly, "you've inherited quite the storm. You forged documents with my mother." He laughed softly. "I don't forge. I facilitate." He claimed Margaret approached him when Ethan's startup began collapsing. Debt restructuring. Private loans. Short-term liquidity. But when liquidity dried up, she panicked. Victor didn't care about the family drama. He cared about exposure. "If federal charges escalate," he said calmly, "everyone tied to those transfers becomes interesting." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm reminding you," he replied. "That scandal spreads." That night, I reviewed the trust structure again and realized something chilling. If the civil claim invalidated the codicil, Victor could gain access to foundation contracts. My mother's lawsuit wasn't desperation. It was strategy. Ethan showed up at my door at 2 a.m. "I need to tell you what she made me sign." Ethan looked wrecked. He admitted he'd signed as secondary guarantor on offshore bridge loans. If the investigation widened, he could face federal charges. "She told me it was temporary," he said. "She said once the trust redistributed, everything would balance. He'd chosen silence to protect her. Now silence could destroy him. "I can testify fully," he whispered. "But if I do, she gets more time. More time. More prison. More permanent fracture. And if he didn't, Victor Harlan might stay protected." So here it was. The choice that would define everything. Protect my brother, or finish what the courtroom started. At sunrise, I stood on the penthouse balcony. Chicago below. Cold air cutting sharp. Ethan stepped beside me. "What would you do?" he asked again. This time I answered. "I'd tell the truth." 2 weeks later, Ethan entered a federal building to amend his testimony. Inside the courtroom, Victor Harlan was already seated. And he wasn't alone. Seated beside him? A woman I hadn't seen in 3 months. My mother, out on temporary federal transfer. And smiling. The federal courthouse feels colder than state court. Not emotionally. Structurally. No marble drama. No society whispers. Just consequences. Ethan amended his testimony. He named Victor Harlan as financial orchestrator of the offshore transfers. He admitted he signed under pressure. He admitted he suspected things weren't clean. And then something unexpected happened. Victor didn't deny it. He smiled and handed prosecutors a sealed folder. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, "I believe the court deserves the full picture." The full picture included emails, phone logs, investment memos, and one signature I wasn't prepared to see. My grandfather's. Prosecutor turned toward Theodore Whitmore and said, "Sir, we need to ask you about 2018. 2 years before the Arizona sale. Before the forged signatures. Before the hospital stay. Victor had advised my grandfather's firm during a liquidity restructuring. Short-term international bridge loans. Complex asset shielding. Legal but aggressive. My grandfather admitted it. Yes, I hired him. But here's the problem. One of those early shell structures? It was the same framework Margaret later used. Victor didn't build the machine alone. He inherited it. From my grandfather. When I confronted him privately, his voice was calm. "I created defensive architecture," he said. "Your mother weaponized it. Or you showed her how." His silence felt heavier than denial. For the first time, the moral ground beneath me shifted. That night, I reviewed archived Foundation Board minutes. Victor's consulting contract had been approved unanimously, including my grandfather's vote. And mine. I was 26 in 2018, freshly added to the Whitmore Foundation Board. I'd signed dozens of documents without question. Trusting family. Trusting legacy. Trusting structure. Victor's defense strategy became clear. If the architecture wasn't illegal when created, then Margaret adapted something that already existed. That doesn't absolve her. But it complicates intent. And federal court cares deeply about intent. Meanwhile, prosecutors started circling my grandfather. Not as defendant, as potential witness. Or worse, if they determined the structure was knowingly designed to obscure oversight, this wasn't just fraud anymore. It was conspiracy. I asked him one question that night. "Did you ever think someone would misuse what you built?" He looked tired for the first time. "I thought my daughter had my ethics." The next morning, Margaret requested a private meeting. With me. Federal holding facility. Margaret sat straighter than ever. "This isn't about greed," she said. "It's about survival." She claimed Victor approached her after 2018. Said the firm was exposed. Said if certain transfers didn't occur, the foundation could face audit complications. He presented it as protection. Not theft. "Your grandfather knew the risks of those structures," she said. "He just didn't want the optics." Then she leaned forward. "I can take Victor down." In exchange, she wanted reduced federal sentencing. And silence from me regarding the codicil civil case. If I cooperated, she'd plead fully. If I didn't, Victor would pivot hard. Toward Theodore. Toward the foundation. Toward legacy. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was negotiation. Prosecutors contacted Adrian that evening. Victor was preparing to implicate my grandfather publicly. Federal preliminary hearing. Victor took the stand first. Polished. Controlled. He painted himself as consultant. Margaret as executor. Ethan as naive signer. And Theodore Whitmore? Visionary but distant. Then Margaret changed the script. Mid-testimony. She requested to amend her statement. She admitted forging, admitted misusing structures, admitted shielding losses from Ethan's failing company. But then she did something no one expected. She turned toward Victor. "And you coached me," she said clearly. "You told me how to move it offshore." The courtroom shifted. Victor's expression flickered, just slightly. She wasn't protecting him. She was cutting him loose. In that moment, I understood something chilling. My mother was many things, but she wasn't weak. She was choosing which empire fell. Victor's or ours. Federal prosecutors announced a grand jury review. Victor Harlan left the courthouse surrounded by cameras. But before getting into his car, he looked directly at me and mouthed one word. "Check." 6:12 a.m. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. News alerts. Board members. Unknown numbers. Headline. Whitmore Foundation linked to multi-year asset diversion scheme. The foundation was now public scandal. Victor had made his move. But that wasn't the worst part. The article quoted internal board emails. Private correspondence. Only 3 people had access to that thread. Me, my grandfather, and Ethan. I called my brother immediately. No answer. By noon, federal investigators formally requested digital access to my personal devices. Ethan showed up that evening. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Did you leak the emails?" I asked. "Are you serious?" he snapped. Then he played a recording. My voice. Private conversation. From my penthouse balcony. Discussing Victor. It had been recorded without my knowledge. Victor had accessed my phone and sent the recording to Ethan. "You've been meeting him," I said quietly. Ethan didn't deny it. He said he could protect me. From federal exposure. From being tied to offshore accounts. Then he said something that hit harder than the recording. "Mom told me to distance you. To make you look unstable if things escalated." It wasn't just financial betrayal. It was strategic isolation. Ethan admitted he'd met Victor 3 times after the federal investigation began. I went back into Foundation archives. Older amendments. Drafts never filed. And then I found it. A 2019 estate revision draft. Originally naming Ethan as primary successor. It was replaced months later. With my name. I confronted my grandfather. He didn't deny it. "You were capable," he said. But Ethan was easier. Easier. The word echoed. I wasn't the first choice. I was the correction. The ethical safeguard. Not the legacy. And then I realized something worse. The will didn't change because he loved me more. It changed because he discovered something. Something about Ethan. That night, Victor sent me a message. Ask him about the DNA test. I met Victor in a neutral office downtown. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside, DNA report, dated 2021. Test subjects, Theodore Whitmore and Ethan Whitmore. Result, 0% paternal match. Ethan wasn't his biological grandson. The test was ordered quietly, privately, months before the will changed. My mother had an affair decades ago. The discovery shattered the illusion of lineage. The penthouse wasn't just inheritance. It was correction of bloodline. I drove straight to Ethan's place. Sent him the report. He replied with one sentence. Did he know before I was born? I didn't know, but I feared the answer. Grandfather requested a family meeting. No lawyers. No press. Just the 3 of us. No attorneys. No statements. Just truth. My grandfather admitted he had suspected for years, but confirmed it in 2021 after financial irregularities raised doubt. He changed the will after the DNA test. Not before. Ethan looked hollow. So I was conditional, he asked. No one answered. The room felt airless. Everything we'd fought about, money, fraud, reputation, was layered over something deeper. Identity betrayal. Ethan stood up slowly. You all decided who I was without telling me. He looked at me. You think you won? I shook my head. This isn't winning. It wasn't. It was collapse. The next morning, breaking news hit. Victor Harlan had been arrested on federal conspiracy charges. But before being taken into custody, he filed a sworn affidavit. And in that affidavit, he claimed, the Whitmore legacy was built on secrecy long before I arrived. He listed 27 names, including Theodore Whitmore. Victor Harlan's affidavit triggered a federal grand jury review. Not a trial. Not yet. But something more dangerous. A deep audit. The name that echoed in the courthouse hallways wasn't Margaret. It wasn't Ethan. It was Theodore Whitmore. My grandfather. For 40 years, his reputation had been clean, disciplined, philanthropic. Now federal investigators were reviewing 15 years of foundation transfers. I met him outside the courthouse. He looked composed. Too composed. You knew the structures were aggressive, I said quietly. Yes. And you signed them anyway. Yes. No denial. No panic. Just calm acceptance. I built protections, he said. Your mother weaponized them. But the line between protection and concealment had blurred. And federal law does not reward blurred lines. That evening, Ethan received a formal immunity offer from prosecutors. In exchange for full testimony. Against our grandfather. Ethan showed me the document. Immunity from federal prosecution. Conditional on cooperation. Full cooperation. That meant emails. Conversations. Private family strategy. If I don't take it, I could go down with him, Ethan said. If you do take it, you help dismantle him, I replied. He looked exhausted. You think he wouldn't sacrifice us to save the foundation? The question lingered. Because deep down, I didn't know. Ethan wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. He was thinking about survival. The next morning, Ethan signed the immunity agreement. Grand jury sessions are private. Silent. Sealed. But leaks always find daylight. Within days, rumors spread. Ethan confirmed that structural shielding mechanisms predated Margaret's fraud. He confirmed that offshore routing systems were originally approved during foundation restructuring. He did not accuse. He did not embellish. He simply confirmed. Truth can be more destructive than accusation. My grandfather didn't speak to him after that. Didn't yell. Didn't argue. Just silence. And somehow that hurt Ethan more. Federal compliance officers froze one of the foundation's major accounts pending review. Millions locked. Operations paused. Emergency board meeting. The mood had shifted. Not scandal. Fear. If criminal exposure expanded, donors would pull. If donors pulled, projects collapsed. Hospitals. Scholarships. Grants. The board quietly discussed distancing from Theodore. Temporary leadership transition. He sat at the head of the table, listening. When the motion was raised, he didn't fight it. He resigned voluntarily. 40 years. Gone in one vote. I watched the man who built everything step down without protest. Not because he admitted guilt, but because he understood optics. Afterward, he said only one thing to me. Legacy isn't what you build. It's what survives you. That night, prosecutors requested a private interview with me. Not as witness. As potential co-signer on 2018 restructuring approvals. I reviewed the documents carefully. And there it was. My signature. Board approval. 2018 restructuring vote. I hadn't understood the implications at 26. But legally, understanding isn't always required. Only authorization. Adrian, my attorney, was blunt. They won't indict you. But they could pressure you. To testify? Yes. Against him? He didn't answer. Ethan had already chosen survival. My mother had chosen leverage. Victor had chosen exposure. Now it was my turn. The next morning, I met my grandfather privately. I may have to testify, I said. He nodded slowly. If that's what preserves the foundation. That was the moment I understood. He would sacrifice himself. Without saying it directly. Not out of guilt. Out of control. Even now, he was managing the board. Managing perception. Managing the fall. And I realized something chilling. In this family, sacrifice is never pure. It's strategic. Federal prosecutors announced. No criminal indictment against Theodore Whitmore. But severe regulatory penalties. The foundation survives. Reduced. Monitored. Publicly humbled. Ethan is cleared. Margaret remains incarcerated. Victor awaits trial. And that night, my grandfather handed me a sealed envelope. There's something you still don't know, he said. Inside was a dated letter. From 1993. Signed by someone whose name I had never heard before. And at the bottom, the words, regarding the Whitmore heir. Margaret requested to see me. Not Ethan. Not her attorney. Me. The prison visitation room was colder than I remembered. She didn't look broken. She looked patient. You think the DNA test explains everything, she said calmly. It does, I replied. It explains why the will changed. She smiled slightly. That test wasn't ordered because of suspicion of an affair. Silence. It was ordered because your grandfather panicked. About what? About you. The words hit wrong. He thought you might not be his son's daughter. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. Margaret slid a document across the table. A lab requisition form. 2 names listed for comparison. Theodore Whitmore. Claire Whitmore. The test had been ordered in 2021. The same year as Ethan's. But mine had been kept sealed. Your grandfather had doubts, Margaret said. About my mother? About timing. I understood. My father had died young. There had been rumors. Always whispers around that year. The results. Margaret leaned back. They matched. Relief hit too quickly. Then she added. But not fully. Not fully. There was a genetic anomaly. She let that hang. Your grandfather spent months consulting private specialists. He feared a lab error. Or something else. A possibility no one wanted to say aloud. That night, I searched the original lab. It had closed abruptly in 2022. Adrian helped trace archived records. The anomaly wasn't small. It suggested partial mosaicism. Meaning, Theodore could share DNA markers inconsistently. Rare, but possible. And if true, the 0% paternal match on Ethan's test could be flawed, misinterpreted, or manipulated. I confronted my grandfather. He didn't deny the second test. I needed certainty, he said. And did you get it? No. He had built an empire on precision. And now his bloodline was statistically ambiguous. That uncertainty changed everything. The will. The codicil. The trust hierarchy. It wasn't greed that altered succession. It was doubt. Ethan ordered a 3rd independent DNA test. Without telling anyone. Private clinic. Neutral lab. No family involvement. Results delivered simultaneously. Ethan opened his first. He read silently. Then looked up at me. Tears, but not anger. Partial match, he said. Not 0. Not full. Partial. Same anomaly marker as mine. We both carried it. Meaning, the 2021 test declaring Ethan unrelated? Likely misread. Or simplified. My mother watched us both carefully. The timing of that first lab's closure, she said softly, wasn't coincidence. The implication chilled me. Someone had wanted certainty. Not accuracy. Financial records showed the original lab received a private payment from a Whitmore-linked entity 2 weeks before issuing Ethan's 0% result. We confronted him together. My grandfather sat in his study, DNA reports spread across his desk. You paid the lab, I said quietly. I paid for expedited analysis. They issued a false certainty. He closed his eyes. I needed clarity. You needed control, Ethan said. Silence filled the room. The truth settled slowly. The DNA doubt wasn't about biology. It was about legacy management. He couldn't tolerate uncertainty. So he forced it. And when that forced certainty disinherited Ethan, he rationalized it as protection. Protection of the foundation. Protection of the name. Not protection of his grandson. Or granddaughter. Margaret spoke last. You built your empire on control, she said calmly. And when blood became unpredictable, you chose structure over family. For the first time in this entire saga, Theodore Whitmore looked defeated. Not legally. Emotionally. The revised DNA findings were submitted to federal investigators as part of ongoing reviews. If it's proven that estate decisions were made based on manipulated scientific reporting, the codicil could be invalidated, the inheritance reshuffled, the penthouse no longer unquestionably mine. And as Ethan and I stood on the balcony that night, he said quietly, so if we're both his, what happens now? The DNA revision didn't explode publicly. It didn't trend. It didn't destroy the foundation. It did something quieter. It equalized us. Ethan and I were both biologically linked. Both misled. Both used as leverage. The codicil clause, the automatic disinheritance provision, was now legally vulnerable. If succession decisions were made based on manipulated lab certainty, estate challenges could reopen everything. We stood on the penthouse balcony at sunrise. "So what do we do?" Ethan asked. For the first time in years, it wasn't adversarial. It was collaborative. "We stop fighting over what's broken," I said, "and decide what survives." We requested a private meeting with the foundation board, together. The board expected conflict. They got alignment. Ethan spoke first. "No more shielding structures." I followed. "No more discretionary trust opacity." We proposed independent compliance oversight, public annual transparency reports, removal of automatic error clauses, leadership transition to co-directorship. The board was stunned. Whitmore's succession had always been singular. Now we were offering shared authority. And something else. We requested our grandfather step into permanent honorary status. No operational power. He didn't argue. He only said, "Build something I don't recognize." It wasn't sarcasm. It was surrender. Margaret requested early parole consideration and named us in her application. Margaret's parole hearing was not dramatic. No tears. No speeches. Just accountability. She admitted financial fraud. Admitted manipulation. But she also acknowledged something new. "I raised my children in a culture of silence." She looked at Ethan. Then at me. "They're choosing transparency." I didn't. We submitted letters supporting conditional release. Not because she deserved redemption automatically, but because punishment without repair is unfinished. Parole was granted. Supervised. Restricted. But granted. The first Sunday dinner after her release was scheduled at the penthouse. For chairs. No lawyers. No board members. No press. Margaret looked smaller. Grandfather looked older. Ethan looked cautious. I set the table. No speeches. No apologies forced. Just food. Halfway through dinner, my grandfather spoke. I confused control with protection. Margaret nodded slowly. I confused sacrifice with strategy. Ethan added quietly. I confused loyalty with silence. They all looked at me. I exhaled. I confused justice with distance. The table didn't heal us. But it did something important. It ended performance. For the first time in years, no one was managing optics. Just truth. Grandfather handed Ethan and me a revised trust document. And signed. The new trust did something radical. No automatic heirs. No codicil punishment clauses. No bloodline priority. Succession would be performance-based. Board elected. Term limited. We signed it together. Not because we trusted each other blindly, but because we trusted the system we were building. 3 months later, the Whitmore Foundation released its first fully transparent financial report. Public access. Independent audit. Open governance. Donations dipped initially, then stabilized. Because credibility, once broken and rebuilt honestly, is stronger than reputation built on silence. Grandfather moved into advisory status. Margaret began financial ethics lectures under supervision, not to restore status, but to own mistakes publicly. Ethan took over operational strategy. I focused on structural reform and community partnerships. And the penthouse? I kept it, not as victory, but as reminder. Legacy isn't inherited. It's redesigned. We thought betrayal ended families. What we learned was this. Unspoken truth does. And the only thing stronger than inheritance is accountability chosen willingly.